Hungry Trilobyte podcast would like to start by acknowledging SoonerCon. Get ready for the next chapter in Oklahoma's longest running fan run pop culture convention. SoonerCon will be returning in 2024, June 21st through 23rd. Get ready for a weekend of cosplay, fun and excitement, vendors, gaming, and more. You can go to SoonerCon.com for more information. Back again, we have Chris Byrne. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing just great. Thank you.
We got together last time in episode 125 when I got to just kind of throw around some ideas and ask you about the basic structure of how toys came to be the way they are now. But another topic came up that I had to reach out to you about.
Okay.
Okay. So I just want to give you some background. I was talking with a friend who is a little older than I am, just a teeny tiny bit, just enough that their perspective is a little different than I am. And this person said to me, because they were watching the new Transformers movies, man, it seems like Transformers would be something girls would like, and yet I never hear about girls playing with them. I never hear it being pitched as a girl thing. Why wasn't that the case? And it made sense to me growing up in the 80s, but it didn't make sense to them.
Right.
A- And my take was that I remember from the mid 80s there was a very distinct separation between toys that were aimed at girls and toys that were aimed at boys, and that was by design, and there was not any desire to separate to merge the two at all.
Right.
And I can remember steps in the 90s where that trend reversed itself, but to even though they probably could have sold a lot more, they just didn't want to go that route. And I was wondering if my personal take meshed with your reality, your researched reality.
Well, I don't think it wasn't that they didn't market them to girls. They were not marketed to girls, but at the time, certainly in the 80s, the prevailing sentiment and certainly the prevailing culture was that there were boys' toys and girls' toys, and boys played this way and girls played this way. Because at the same time that the Transformers and Masters of the Universe were coming up, we had Strawberry Shortcake and Holly Hobby and My Little Pony, and all sort of rainbows and unicorns over here and violence and superheroes over here. And on some level, that is a natural division in the way the genders play. But at the same time, there were a ton of girls later in the 80s who loved Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So it wasn't that they didn't market them to girls. It's that nobody thought girls would like them.
And that again coincides well with my experiences that Ninja Turtles, from my perspective, being in the target market at the time, that was like the first time we really saw girls embrace something that we were into and that the culture didn't seem to mind it so much. It was somewhat okay. And then it seemed like a couple of years later, Power Rangers kind of added a little bit of inertia to that.
Right,
And
right.
by the end of the 90s, girls and boys playing with the same things was more of an expectation.
I think so. And I think what they realized is exactly what your friend realized, which is there's a missed opportunity here. The Teenage Ninja Turtles had April, who was their sort of human cohort, and the Power Rangers had the Pink Ranger. Now, talk about gender and color another time, but the Pink Ranger was a girl. So it actually began to equal that boys and girls were more equal, and that really did reflect the culture at the time.
Was this something that the industry communicated, or was this something that was just a conversation with the consumer?
I think it was probably a conversation with the consumer through research to see what people were buying, to know where the sales were going, and to quite frankly try to broaden the audience. Because as we get from the 80s into the 90s, the entertainment marketplace becomes more crowded, more complicated, more competitive. Not as much as it is today, but very much more competitive. So the goal would be to appeal to as broad an audience as you possibly could.
And I mean, countering that with something like Lego, which from the beginning always tried to take a very neutral stance toward gender, and that just kind of continued to do its own thing for the next 30 years.
Right. Right. But Lego comes along, and Lego starts in 99. They start with Lego Star Wars, and they start all this licensing stuff. And Star Wars really did skew more to boys. It's not that girls didn't play with it, but it skewed more to boys. And then you come, I don't know, it was like I don't remember the exact year, but you have Lego Friends, which is a whole girls line. It's a whole pink and purple and pony line designed primarily to appeal to girls. And now the pendulum swung back the other way because it's now basically just sort of a Lego line that's more town, which is going back to what Lego's very first theme set.
There's certain core things that Lego always kind of has to be: the space, the town, the castle.
Right.
And I think that that's a good grounding, because that's a common fantasy for almost anybody, young or old, male or female.
Exactly. Because kids play what they see around them. Not many kids are on Tatooine in real life. In real life, they are in a neighborhood and they see a postman and and maybe they think about seeing horses, but it's really more playing what they see around them.
And to go back to my friend for a minute, it just struck me as interesting that it took me a minute to break down why this was things were the way they were at the time, and it just seemed like, because we were talking about the last time you and I spoke, that there was a long time when toys were just one-off creations that were sold until that thing didn't sell anymore. Then they made the new thing, and it took a long time for there to be a toy line. And in the same way, it's like it took way too long to get to the point where boys and girls would play with the same toys, and yet that actual transition happened in the span of 15, 20 years.
Yeah, well, it's a generational shift. You go from the boomers, where it was very separated, to Gen X, where you started to blur that line, and then you have the millennials, where there really is. You're trying to get rid of that. You're trying to get rid of. People are coming out against pink. People are saying, well, why shouldn't it be one color or another? Why do you Target no longer has a girls aisle and a boys aisle when you go shopping there? They're just toy aisles.
I mean, I remember at the very beginning of the 90s, when this was just kind of starting to unravel, I was reading about the board game industry, and they were saying that their research had shown, and I love how they always act like that's this definitive proof of anything, but research had shown that they would put girls and boys in the commercials playing together, but the boys always had to win, because the boys wouldn't buy a game if they thought the girls would win. And I'm just wondering how they came up with this theory and how it was tested.
I think that is cultural bias, and that the research was designed to confirm that bias. And it's not, I think that is more the adult hegemony than necessarily what the kids experience. More, kids don't experience that gender differentiation until they're about age 5, and then any kind of characteristics attached to one gender, that's taught. That's culturally taught in the home. So, but you talk about commercials, like in the 60s, dad was always the doofus, right? So it was the kids who were empowered to win because they got to beat the parents, and that was appealing.
Yeah, how could it be anything else? I mean, you can't say you could come up with a serious theory by, what were you talking to a bunch of boys and girls and watching them play the game and you came up with this? I'm sorry, I just don't buy it.
Well, having done a lot of research in my life for different things, I am struggling to see how you would structure that research to come away with that as the definitive variable that determined who would buy your game.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. But when we had our back and forth through email about this, you had mentioned that you saw a lot of the impact from the recent Barbie movie affecting this conversation now.
Yeah, well, the Barbie movie, which is brilliant. I've seen it twice, and it's really amazing to me to see how the all the empowerment that Barbie always represented, how that actually played out in the culture, and that we still have these cultural norms for women. And I don't know if you've seen the movie or if your listeners have seen the movie, but America Ferrara does a whole monologue about what's expected of women, and it's really quite wonderful. And it really does show the dichotomy that still exists in the culture.
And you're seeing this when it comes to how we're marketing things like toys, for example. But I can see this expanded to all sorts of hobby activities, like board games, video games, and so forth.
Right. And I think that people make a lot of assumptions in the toy industry. People assume that girls aren't going to going to want to play Dungeons and Dragons. They're not going to want to play role-playing games because, oh, that's just too competitive for the little darlings. That's nonsense. Yeah, that's absolute nonsense. I've known girls in my life, and this is of course anecdotal, who are much more competitive than I am.
Mhm.
You
I
know,
have a solid rule, and I will tell this to anybody who takes this pick up a sport. Do not play paintball against cheerleaders. Trust me on this. I know from experience. But to get back to, I see that when I said video games and board games, I often wondered if that was kind of playing into this a little bit because when video games really started picking up at the tail end of the 80s, that was a case of where I don't think it was really possible to differentiate those by gender, and they became so popular, it just became almost a pushing force to stop this artificial separation.
yeah, I think that definitely video games, Pong and all the Mario games and all of the really Nintendo has been probably the leader at gender neutral games, if you will, because of all the characters that are in Mario's and Luigi's world. Uh, you get into things like Mortal Kombat and some of the more competitive war-based games. Those do tend to appeal more to boys, or men, really. But I can't say that there are no women who don't play it. I played House of the Dead 3 with some very tough women.
Hmm, hmm. And I think especially Smash Brothers in particular is a nice little middle ground there where you can get very, very competitive, and yet it still has so many characters that it becomes accessible. And to be fair, I guess the more recent Mortal Kombats with the giant character rosters are not that far behind.
Right, right. And I think it's about the narrative and it's about really giving permission. If you go back and you look at the original Erector set, I don't think it's like from 1915 or something, it just says in big letters, "Hey, boys," because God forbid a woman would ever do something as difficult as putting a nut and a screw together.
I see that a lot. I read a lot of really old comic books, and there is definitely a bias on that. And then I start to wonder, what is the system here? I mean, you're having an ad that's geared to selling a toy to a boy, and it's in a comic book, which is the presumed audience is that it's being bought by a boy, but there's no guarantee of that.
Right, right.
Odds were probably a little bit better in the 60s and 50s, but that's still not really anything to go on. And how many assumptions were made in this process here?
Many, and many that reflect the culture, many that reflect the sort of madmen roles of the Eisenhower years of of the women. And if you read but the female eunuch, right? Right, from back in the 60s, and the whole idea that women adopted these roles to be subservient to men as a survival mechanism. I mean, that's going way beyond toys, but it is a kind of cultural zeitgeist that people were teaching children. If you look at toy catalogs from the 20s, all of the toys targeted to girls are about mother and nurturing and home care and being, essentially a servant.
And toys in the 20s were not that complex or sophisticated compared to what we think of today or even what we thought of in the 80s.
Right, right.
So
And
that's what, go ahead, go ahead.
no, and Barbie in 1959 had two choices, bride or teenage fashion model, pretty much. Now she's had a couple of hundred careers, and she is now representative of so much more diverse possibility. And because we accept as a culture that possibility is available to both genders now.
So, I mean, if you're in the 20s and you're coming out with, you're trying to design toys for girls, and this is the first thing you have out of the gate. Uh, I became, was there anything else beyond that? You said, geared toward motherhood, and that's about it.
Right. I mean, some of the catalogs are things like a little ironing board, a dinner service, a tea set. There are trucks and cars and things for boys, construction vehicles, things like Lincoln Logs. But it was just always presumed that girls wouldn't be interested in it because the culture was defining the role for them, rather the male dominated culture was defining their role rather than them being empowered to define their role themselves, which is really what changed in Barbie around 1985 when Jill Barad and John Ammerman came up with "We Girls Can Do Anything."
And if I'm remembering my history correctly, that was as a bit of a response to the fact that the Barbie brand had taken a bit of a dip at that exact point,
Exactly.
and they were trying to ask themselves why. And this is the part that I'm looking at. It's like this was the one example in this conversation where somebody said, "How can we how can we sell better to make more money?" Instead of just pushing this narrative, they said, "Let's find the narrative the customer wants and play to that."
Exactly. And it's a changing customer. It's a changing customer at that time had gone through all the struggles with trying to pass and ratify the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and more women in the workplace. And we were getting into, the movie Working Girl and all of that stuff. So there was much more empowerment of women in the culture. So that then that would inevitably trickle down to toys and girls and role models for these girls that they would express through their play.
And the idea is that there's probably 10 years prior to that, there might have been some discomfort with the message that these dolls were sending. I'm just going to pick on Barbie because that's the current topic here.
Sure.
And it took a while for that momentum to build to the point. It's like, no, we have to change because there's a certain generation that doesn't want this message to be the one that gets passed on anymore.
Right. They're not going to buy that product. If you're
Yeah.
telling them, you have to be Susie Homemaker, not to pick on a good brand from the 60s, but if you're going to be Susie Homemaker, well, they want more than that. And they're not going to pretend to be something that they're not aspiring to in their fantasy.
I mean, just at almost the exact same point in time, maybe a few years prior, G.I. Joe had a very similar soul searching moment where it's like they looked at this and said, people look at a soldier figure and they see the Vietnam War, and that's
Exactly.
something that we don't want to carry through. How can we retool this? And the end result is, in some ways, very similar.
Right. But he became a real American hero. He was fighting intergalactic and extraterrestrial beings. And it's still the essence of G.I. Joe play. It's the essence of a lot of uh, play that appeals primarily to the male gender, power and conflict and dominance. And that's just part of who we are as biological creatures. But and women do tend to be more cooperative and nurturing. But within those two huge rubrics, there's a lot of room for how does that get expressed.
Hmm. And that's a really good way to put it. And that's something I was trying to mull through my head here, and I was not doing a good job of it. But it's like, you can say, okay, well, uh, broadly, a boy would want to have something that involves problem solving and conquest, and a girl would like something that involves collaboration and cooperation. But there's so many ways we can manifest that besides soldier and mother.
Yes,
To
exactly.
boil either gender back down to those two basic roles is such a disservice.
Yeah, it is. It is. And clearly it worked for a while. Not that long in the big scheme of things, but it worked for a while. And the toy industry, especially, only thrives by reflecting the culture at large. And it's the culture that the kids are coming into at that time. So on some levels, it's gonna lag a little bit behind, but it's always playing catch up.
With all the research you've done, I really think I would like to ask, is there a certain time frame that seems to click where you can see like the point between when the lesson is taught and when the lesson is learned in the toy industry?
That is a great question, and I think it's really hard to pinpoint an exact time, but I definitely think from the mid '80s because you began the '80s, as we were saying, with Care Bears and Strawberry Shortcake and Holly Hobby and all of those things. The American Greeting stuff, with GI Joe in its second iteration, Masters of the Universe, the beginning of Star Wars, all of that. And suddenly you've got fans of both from both genders. Boys like Care Bears. What? Shocking. Girls like Star Wars. Shocking. And suddenly they realize that the audience, suddenly that the toy industry people or the entertainment people who were mired in 10 years earlier suddenly woke up and said, hey, wait a minute, it's a different consumer out there. We need to direct stuff to them.
And I mean, I look at this for I had Star Wars stuff and Care Bear stuff as a kid. I mean, that I totally get where you're coming from
Right.
here. I am exactly who you're talking about here. But I'm looking at this and I'm trying to think to like the the late late 90s, early 2000s, when I was not buying toys for, to play with anymore. I would occasionally get them for collectibles,
Right.
but I would see these cases where people would be talking about how uh, they they were worried about the increase in screen time the kids were getting at that point in time, and there was talks about how some toys might be uh, too sexual for the girls, too violent for the boys, and I'm just thinking it seemed like in the mid 2000s, like 2006, 7, 8, there started to be more toys that were geared toward cooperation and rescue and really gearing down the complaints that they had in the mid 90s. It seemed like a 6 to 7 year span seemed to be what was needed for the lessons to be learned.
Right, which makes sense because we sort of figure a generation of kids is 8 years, right? So like
Mhm.
every 8 years, there's a new generation of kids, because they're usually out of toys by 8. But to your point about sexualizing and all of that stuff, a lot of that was adults who didn't understand children. The Bratz dolls, perfect example. Adults would look at that and say, "Oh my gosh, she's a woman of questionable reputation," and little girls would look at it and go, "Pretty." So the people project their own consciousness and their own sensibilities onto that inert lump of plastic.
I was actually thinking exactly of the Bratz dolls, but I was trying not to pick on another doll.
I'll go there.
I mean,
Yeah.
I remember when I was a kid and Gem was the big thing,
Oh
and
yeah.
our teachers warning us that maybe we shouldn't be idolizing Gem. And I'm like, it's a cartoon. I don't idolize it. I watch it because it's fun.
Right. Right.
And I almost felt like I was trying to explain this to my teachers. Like, you're not understanding what's involved here. We're just wanting to have a good time. That's it.
Right, right. And children perceive things. I just got to do a thing and they said, "What is the one thing you want people in the entertainment and toy industry to do?" And I said, "Respect children. Understand how they develop and what they perceive at a certain age." Because I'll give you an example. If you sat down and told a 5-year-old literally how reproduction happened, they would laugh at you because they have not got the brain development to even conceive of that. So it would be like they wouldn't even get it. And it's like if you've watched movies or TVs with a little child, you can see the stuff that goes right over their head because they're just not ready for it. So
And it's part of the life experience. Even if you never watch movies or TV, just so much of what happens in life just goes over their head. They soak up what they're ready for. They soak
exactly.
up.
I'll give you an example. My niece, when she was, I think, 8, got obsessed with listening to Les Miserables. And so and I hadn't seen it in years, and there was a revival on Broadway. So I said, "Okay, I'll take you to see it." And we're sitting there, and all of a sudden I'm going, "Okay, prostitution, da, 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 all of this stuff, and my niece just thought, "Oh, that poor little girl." That's what she got.
And that's just the basis of being a child, is that you grab what you can and you make
Right.
sense of it. And sometimes that's how you start to get new concepts in. You see something you don't understand, you start to play with it a bit. Eventually, you might have to ask an adult for some clarification. You might read a book. And it's like there's this assumption that by some people that kids are going to get an idea that they're not ready for, and they're just going to wholeheartedly embrace it because the toy said so, the book said so, the TV show said so, forgetting the fact that kids constantly reevaluate what they're learning all the time.
Right. And the one of the things in kids entertainment, you're not allowed to do a replicatable act in a TV show. And my brothers and I grew up watching Roadrunner, right?
Mhm.
And I laugh because yeah, we really tried to drop an anvil on each other. you know? And the thing about dropping an anvil is it's funny to kids because they're just beginning to understand things like gravity and weight. So the idea that you could make an anvil fly, they get that is playing with reality and therefore it's funny. It's not like they're going to go out to the shop and try to drop the anvil on their brother.
Right. And how many times has that actually happened?
I think none.
Okay. I mean, there's just the famous case of, I don't know if it's still out there, but there was a run of Superman costumes where they actually had a disclaimer that says cape does not allow you to fly.
Right.
because unfortunately, I think one kid actually did try it. Tragically, it's horrible, but I don't think it was ever the sign of a trend.
No, no. And the other, if you see one of those warnings on a toy like that, you can bet somebody tried it. And you'll scratch your head and go, what? Why did they do that?
Or I just picked up a GI Joe thing not too long ago, and it said guns do not actually shoot, and I kind of remember that from when I was a kid too.
Right,
And there were sometimes GI Joe weapons that would shoot, so that was worth
right,
pointing out. But then I think, even if it did, what kind of damage could it do?
right, right. For 9.99 with the doll. Yeah.
Yes.
You can't build that for that.
No, even this, the bullet would be so tiny, it would be like the size of a hair.
Right,
Why are we worried about this?
right. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that it seems that so many people really don't give kids enough credit, and they don't give adults enough credit for being able to, raise these kids.
And they don't give enough credit to kids to if they don't understand something, they'll come back. I talked about Roadrunner, about Bugs Bunny, right? We watched Bugs Bunny when I was a kid. It was on all the time. Now I see some of them as an adult, and I go, oh my gosh, that's where I first heard Wagner. That's
Mhm.
where I first heard this. My sword and magic helmet, my sword and that that was what's opera, doc.
Mhm.
And so as you become an adult, then you appreciate it and you remember the pleasure you got out of it as a kid. So there's that double-sided experience, if you will, of as an adult, of being a kid and now appreciating it as an adult.
And now we're getting into a whole other area where it's like you got to realize that many of those cartoons, particularly Warner Brothers cartoons, were not aimed at kids
Right,
originally. They were
right,
previews to movies that were coming out, and that was for an adult going out for a nice evening on the town. That was what they showed before the movie, so they were deliberately gearing them toward adults.
right. Flintstones and the Jetsons too, back in the 60s. Those were big. Those were those the Honeymooners or whatever as a cartoon in the Stone Age.
People will look at this and they'll say, "Well, what about the kids?" Like, it wasn't meant for kids. Kids found if they liked it and they gleamed onto it, and then somebody said, "Well, we can sell these as cheap TV programs in the
Right,
50s and 60s." But it's like Star Wars wasn't designed for kids. It was
right.
designed for adults. Kids liked it, and that's, again, we're just presuming that kids aren't going. That kids need something made specifically for them when kids are going to watch something that they recognize the quality.
Right. And I always say, I mean, I won't name any of the shows, but I would watch these shows and I go, well, that's boring because the kid is there's nothing there's no conflict. When they brought back Strawberry Shortcake, they took out the purple pie man because pie man or whatever, because they thought kids would be scared by it. But kids need that vicarious scaring. They need to see the Wizard of Oz. They need to see the flying monkeys and be scared by it because they have that vicarious experience. So they've already had an experience of being scared and being okay. That when you come to that in real life, that's the point. That was the whole point behind Grimm's fairy tales, grim as they were.
We need to give the story some teeth.
Yeah,
We need to let the kids think that there is something at stake. And like I said, in the mid 2000s, I saw a lot of toy lines and TV shows that really tried to remove the need for a villain. They
right.
really just, yeah, they were based on, we are rescuing, we're building, and then that there's a place for that. I should
Absolutely.
definitely, but it was like the idea of having somebody wanting something bad to happen was verboten for a couple of years.
Right, right. And you go back to 1938 with Thomas the Train. He was quite moralistic. The original Thomas the Train was really modeling this proper British morality for
Mhm.
children as a train.
And we look at what actually works, and villains work. The villains are often the best
Oh
selling
yeah,
figures out of the whole line.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, who do you buy from Dr. Seuss? You buy the Grinch, right? Because and even though he's redeemed, there is that sort of, which is another storyline. The villain who is redeemed is another great storyline. But kids love the villain, but they also love it when the villain gets his comeuppance. They love we all like that moralistic closure on something.
I mean, I know a lot of my friends, when we would put together something from like Transformers, there was always that neat little idea of, oh, what if we have this character change sides? How does
Right.
that change everything? And that the storytelling aspects of most toys are a very underrated property of them. Is that we're teaching kids how to play with storytelling, drama, personality, sense of self.
Right. And really it's the narrative that creates the play. It's not the piece of plastic. It's how the child animates it with their imagination that makes it. And where does that narrative come from? And there was a lot of fear in the 80s with Peggy Charon and Actions for Children's Television that kids would just be parroting the storylines they saw on TV. Not really the case. Most kids will take those toys and use them almost in a kind of Jungian way to act out the trauma, childhood trauma in quotes, that they've experienced, and resolve things in their minds. It's a very important part of development and mental health.
And I really have to wonder how long that fear would last when if you just give a kid a batch of toys for an afternoon, especially a couple of kids, and just let them go out to go to town,
Right.
you will never have that fear because they start maybe from the plot from the TV show, the whatever, and then they go completely off into left field.
Right, exactly. And they will integrate the characteristics of the properties of a character, say a superhero or something like that. They'll say, oh, well, Spider-Man can't do this. He can't fly without the web, right? Kind of thing. And so there are certain rules in the world, just like in Harry Potter, there's rules of the world of Hogwarts and Harry Potter. And kids will honor those rules in their imaginations, but they'll certainly play their own original stories.
And if you give, say, I'm just picking an example here, you give a kid a batch of Star Wars figures and you drop in a Ninja Turtle, they're not going to let that Ninja Turtle sit there. They're going to find a place for
Right.
that, even though it doesn't fit the internal logic of the world. It's something they can do something with, and they feel the urge to try it.
Right. And it is. It's kind of like when the people from One Day at a Time dropped in on Empty Nest back in the 90s. It's that kind of thing, because it's two narratives that come together, and suddenly you're on a whole new creative and imaginative train.
And again, we go back to it's always about creativity and imagination, which is what you're trying to get in the child in the first place.
Right, right. And the joy of creativity and imagination, because it's not just idle fantasy. If like Dickens' Hard Times, one of my favorite novels, it's all about facts. We want facts. We don't want fancy. We don't want imagination. We want just facts. And of course, the people who ultimately have facts because it's Dickens do not do as well as the people who are able to imagine things. But the idea is imagination is problem solving. How do we come up with problem solving? How do we have solutions to relationships? Asking that question, what if, which is really the essence of play. So what if the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arrive into the Star Wars world? What if that? And then you're off and playing.
And honestly, it doesn't seem like it would be that far fetched because with as many weird things are in Star Wars, what's one more? What's four
Right,
more?
right, right, exactly.
So, Chris, I want to thank you for giving me that insight there because, frankly, it was something that was bugging me for a bit, and it was a lot of fun to hash that out.
That's fun. I love it.
So, is there something else that you might want to throw in there, just as your current take on where this conversation is going?
Well, I do. I have this, after seeing the Barbie movie now twice. I have all of these thoughts about Ken.
I'm listening. You
Have you
have my
seen Ken?
attention.
Have you seen the movie?
I actually confess I have not. I've wanted to see it, but it has been that kind of summer.
Okay, well, there's going to be some spoiler alerts in here, but
I live with it.
ultimately Ken has to decide who he is as an independent person. But the reason that Ken has gotten short shrift is that when Barbie came out in 1959 and in 61, when Ken showed up on the scene, girls would play with Barbie until they were 10 or 11, right? And when you're 10 or 11, you're seeing your older sisters, your cousins, they're starting to date. So the idea of dating is sort of in the back of your mind. So the game Mystery Date at the time and all of that. So, but now that Barbie is 4, 5, 6 years old, that doesn't, dating doesn't even come into their mind. So Ken really is, what is Ken's purpose? For the play of a 4 to 6 year old versus a 10 to 11-year-old. And I think the other thing I thought about it is, you watch that movie and you think, girls had all of these opportunities to create and play, and we have so limited boys in our culture as to what they can do. We really do need to let Ken go discover who he is.
That's really profound. I like that a lot. And I think in general, we could have a whole conversation about just how we're limiting everybody. I mean, to say one group is more limited than another, I don't even, I'm not prepared to talk about that. But
Right,
it's like, I spent a lot of time thinking about just how much have we just told people, you have to do this or that, and you don't have a third option.
right, right, exactly. Yeah,
And yeah, I think that we're celebrating that now, is just we're able to say this. Let's give people the chance to build their own life and find their own path here.
right. And encourage kids to be who they are, and
Mhm.
encourage kids to experiment with who they are. Just because your son wants to play with Barbie on a Thursday afternoon, that's not a bellwether of horrors to come for you or whatever. It's just like, it's exploring. Let's give children the freedom to explore whatever is in front of them at any given time and see where it takes them.
And don't forget that no matter what you're doing, you're just exposing them to something new. You're giving them something new to play around, and they're playing with their own minds more than anything else.
Right,
The
right.
toy is just a vehicle.
Exactly. And from an educational theory standpoint, that's constructivism in the essence of constructivism. Piaget and Montessori and some of those people who really, that when you're confronted with new information, you either assimilate it into what you know or change what you know to accommodate the new information. So it's all about growing and becoming a broader human being. And it's just, and giving kids those opportunities is just phenomenal.
There's a certain very cynical breed of parent that would say, "Well, you don't need to give kids toys. You give them, some cardboard boxes and a comb, and they'll make it up." I'm like, you don't need running shoes to run, but it freaking helps. Okay.
Right, exactly. And it's what is the toy is, if the toy is a catalyst, or especially the narrative is a catalyst, more and more with whether it's DC or Marvel or Paw Patrol or anything, those characters are a catalyst that we then want to play. I mean, if you go back and read novels in the of the 18th century, and they're playing King Arthur, and they're playing these people from history. At the turn of the century, Noah's Arks were one of the biggest toys out there. So kids are like trying to assimilate that, the
Okay.
story and Bible stories, and at that, because that's the story. Story is elemental to who we are as creatures. So how we experience and express that story is critical.
And for the longest time, I mean, people will go back to the Bible, for example, or to a lesser extent Greek mythology, and or uh, things like uh, Sherlock Holmes or Zorro, or the
Right.
classic stories we go to, and they think that's just the benchmark for. And it's like, no, that's just what people. That was the stories that were accessible at the time. It doesn't make
Right.
them the best. It doesn't make them worse. It's just what they had access to, and they dug it.
Right. They dug it. They dug it. I mean, when my brothers and I came home from church school, we were intent on smiting because we got
That's
a lot of
funny.
smiting.
That is funny. But who doesn't want
We
good
still like smiting.
who wants a good smiting now and then? Come on.
Right, I know, exactly.
I got
But
a couple names.
right, exactly. But it was just, because again, here are thare these people, who are fighting and doing all this stuff, and one's more powerful than the other, and you got this sibling thing going on, and it's just that story was the catalyst for a normal human expression.
Mhm, mhm. And for most of the past several hundred years, most people in Europe or in the Americas would have access to scripture. That
Right.
became the body of work they had, and whether they were true believers or completely not, that was just something they could call a common point of reference.
Exactly. Right. And you bring up a really good point, because what happens is you have communities that are formed around Star Wars. We're Star Wars fans, we're Marvel fans. We you sit down two kids together who don't know each other, but they both play Power Rangers. Suddenly they've got a means of connecting. And then you enhance the social experience of play.
I just saw a meme right before I logged on here about two kids playing, and the comment is like, "Well, I like him. He's my best friend. He doesn't speak English, so we just get right to the karate." which is I can totally remember that. That came like, well, if we can just play, it doesn't really matter.
Right, exactly, and that's a connection, and it is. I mean, there's, I always say that play does three things. It gives kids new experiences, it gives them a chance to explore their world, and most importantly, gives them a chance to express themselves. So those three elements, really, there's a good toy in there.
Chris, speaking of exploring the world, if you and I are ever in the same city, we got to get lunch or something there, hash out some of these ideas in person. But in the meantime, I want to link everything that you have on the website, on my website, aaronbosick.com. I'll put in everything from last time. Is there anything else you want to throw on there for this episode?
No, just come on over and see us and see both of us, and then we'll figure out how we can get together.
Let's do that.
Okay.